Cashflow Diary Podcast, episode 254.
Welcome to yet another exciting episode of the Cashflow Diary Podcast, the podcast that teaches you insider tips, tactics, and strategies for creating leverage streams of cash flow into your life. Learn from top-performing entrepreneurs, business owners, investors, and thought leaders from across the globe as they share their secrets to success. Like what you learn on this and other Cashflow Diary podcast episodes? Go to learninvestingnow.com and sign up to receive powerful tips and information that will help you succeed as an entrepreneur and investor. Now, here's your host, investor, entrepreneur, business owner, educator, speaker, author, and master facilitator of Robert Kiyosaki's cash flow game, Jay Massey.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Cashflow Diary Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Massey, and I'm glad that you are here today because you are going to learn something. Yeah, that's right. You're going to learn something again. That's exactly why we do this, right? You keep showing up because we do our best to find something for you to learn, something, one more idea, one more something. And I think today's guest is going to bring that in spades. Why? Because his perspective is completely different than yours, than mine. Why? Because he's from Australia. Simple as that. That's all it takes. Growing up differently, he'll look at real estate differently. He'll think about everything differently. And I think you're going to learn a lot today. He himself has his own podcast as well. So I'll make sure that you have the ability to go and find out more about that. But what's important for you to understand right now is that we're talking to Reed Goossens. Now, here's the point. Was a qualified structural engineer and project manager. Now, that's impressive, but here's the things that I like. Because he's been doing this for a while, and he loves commercial. Now, you know me and my love affair of commercials. Great. But he also does other real estate investment projects, not only in Australia, but the UK and the US. And the one that I'm probably the most excited about is the London 2012 Olympic Games. Now, you guys know me. I love the Olympics, and I can't possibly imagine having been involved. He's just given me an idea already. Hey, there's a real estate development play right there. I have not had that idea. I have already learned something. So let me get him out here so you can learn something too. Help me welcome Reed Goossens. Reed, you there?
G'day, mate. How's it going?
Great. You've already helped me, so let's help them.
Fantastic. Let's jump into it.
So I tend to ask everybody the same first question. Simply put, I look at today's entrepreneurs a lot like yesterday's superheroes. So when I say superhero, I'm talking, Batman, Robin, Superman, most recently Deadpool, if you want to call it that, right? But before the superhero went out there and was delivering their services to the marketplace in the very fashion that they do, they were typically just a normal person. They had an origin story. They started somewhere. So what we want to know is before all the development projects in all the various countries, and especially the ones at the Olympic Games, what I would really like to know is who is Reed Goossens?
Good question. Good first question off the first cab off the rank, of those like to say. Who is Reed Goossens? Reed Goossens, I'm from Australia, as you can definitely tell.
Yes, that part was obvious.
I love traveling. I love learning. And most recently, over the last 4 or 5 years, I love entrepreneurship, and I love to take control of my life and not be, working for the man, so to speak. So that's in a nutshell, without getting into too much of my background just yet. That's who I am and what makes me tick.
Well, there's something that is in your background that I think somebody is asking themselves right now, or at least going to try to use this as an excuse. Because I said qualified chartered structural engineer.
Right.
Do you need that in order to be a real estate guy?
Not at all. And trust me, Jay, being a qualified chartered engineer in Australia and in the UK, that was because I studied structural engineering back in the day in university. So if we, take a step back, I, finished university in 2007 in Brisbane, Australia, and I went traveling for a couple of years. And this is where the London Olympics comes into it. it was that I was working for an engineering company before I graduated. They gave me a job, and I said, look, I want to go traveling. I don't want to stick around here in Australia anymore. I want to see the world. And they said, well, we've got an opening for you in the London office. Would you like to go? And I said, you bet you I would. So I packed my bags and I went over to London, and I worked on some projects related to the London Olympic Games in regards to development of the Paddington Station. You might know Paddington Bear for those listeners out there.
I do.
Anyway, I was working on the design team, loving it, learning a ton of stuff, but as a structural engineer. So I was still working in the JOB. Cut a long story short, had some incredible experiences working on site, working with the general contractor to understanding negotiations on a big commercial real estate sort of level, but not knowing really what my bosses were doing. So cut a long story short, was over there for about 18 months, came back to Australia, was sitting in my cubicle at a job, and I said, this can't be what I'm doing for the next 40 years of my life. And at the time, I had no idea what that was. And so, but I knew I wanted to, my idea was that I wanted someone to pay me to live my life. I want someone to pay me to go surfing in the morning. I want someone to pay me to just not have to go to work. And it took a long time. It took about, not a long time, but 3 or 4 months where I said to myself, Reed, you've got to make a change. You can't just be in a cubicle for the next 40 years of your life. As glamorous as working on the structure on the Olympic Games was, it's still working on a job, and I still have to answer to a boss, and I still sit in a cubicle and yada, 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 and crunch numbers. And it just wasn't fulfilling enough for me. I wanted to be my own boss. I felt like that I was, I don't want to say star athlete, but I felt I had more to give, and just sitting on the sidelines working a 9 to 5 just wasn't fulfilling enough for me. So I actively went out and tried to learn something. What are all these business owners doing that I'm not doing? How do I become my own boss? And through that, I sort of understood, started to learn about financial education and investing my money into something, getting my money working for me, not just sitting in a bank. And the penny dropped for me in terms of, this was when the first penny dropped anyway. It's happened a lot of times along the way. I said, I'm in engineering. I work with these massive developers. That's it. My dad had a bit of success in real estate. He wasn't not by no means an investor. He's just a teacher, but he had made some smart decisions, and he was very influential in my life. And I said that's what I've got to do. I've got to invest in real estate. But how do I invest in real estate? I've got no idea. I got limited funds. And so after sitting there and making this decision, it's real estate. That's what I wanted to use as a vehicle to create long-term wealth. I picked up the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, and that's the second penny drop in my life. And that is where I started to understand the value of passive income, to start building that check that someone was going to write me every day to live my life and go surfing and travel the world. So that is sort of in a nutshell my background, and that was back in 2008, 2009. Now, don't get me wrong. I've still continued to work up until very recently in engineering. It's a great job and has taken me all over the world, to Fiji, I've worked in New York, and I've worked here in LA. But the passion was to still get involved in real estate investing full time. So a couple of years after I got involved in the real estate world in Australia, I still had a big passion inside me to go and be an expat or an expatriate, as for all you listeners out there who don't know what that is. And that's to live and work in another country. There's a difference to going and visiting a country as a tourist. I loved going and being, living and breathing and the culture and working. And that's a different experience altogether. And I sort of made up, in my mind, I was like, well, I could handle the rat race if I'm living in another country and I can still work and earn some money. So that's what I did. I packed up my bags with my girlfriend and we moved across to the United States, and I landed on the ground. And I wasn't even on the ground in New York less than 2 weeks before I was at my first networking or real estate networking event, because I was passionate about real estate and just, again, back to the Rich Dad Poor Dad, developing passive income. The bug had started about a year prior to that in Australia. I was going to a lot of seminars in Aussie and then a lot of networking events, and I knew I had to surround myself with people, and I was new to the city. So I just went to my first networking event, and I thought Australia had some great networking events, but by gosh, the New York was networking on steroids or something. It was incredible. And that's where sort of everything started, and that's where I met one of my business partners, who is still a business partner today, and we bought a few houses in upstate New York. And I slowly, I bought some cash flowing properties because the entry point here in America is a lot cheaper than it is in Australia, and I just found the value of cash flow through buying, duplexes and triplexes and going in there and forcing appreciation through increasing rents by giving the place a bit of liquor paint and changing the carpets and what else. And that was really valuable lesson. And I've gone on to now develop my own investing company, which is RSM Property Group, and I help pool money together or syndicate on large multifamily deals here in the United States. And I also I'm now developing, more of a personal brand, so to speak, because Jay, you and I have talked about offline a couple of times about the importance of raising capital from other people, but they won't trust you without credibility. So that's really, in a nutshell, where I am today. And moving forward, I'm working just on continuing to develop myself as an entrepreneur here in the United States and work on my business.
Nice. Love it. Love every bit of it. Now, I have a very obvious question. I know someone is asking, and before I get the email, I should ask you. All right. Mm-hmm. You clearly could have chosen anywhere in the world to go.
Right.
So I have to ask you, why the U.S. for two reasons. One, and I think you started hinting at it, but I'm like, there are people in Australia who need housing. Okay. And two, isn't the surfing better over there anyway?
Well, to answer the first question, my girlfriend is American. I'm here in the United States because of that. When I was backpacking and gallivanting around the south of France after my time in London for 6 months, I met her, and we have been dating ever since.
Got it.
She moved to Australia for a period of time, and then we moved back to New York in particular, because when I traveled through New York, it was a city that it captured me. It was like, wow, there's something about it. There's a vibe about it. There's like, you're walking down the street thinking you're killing it in life, but you look across the road, there's a 22 CEO of some, Facebook X company, and you're like, geez, I need to pick up my game. And so it was more of a city that I could feel it feed off the energy. Admittedly, the cold and the winter was right. It was to its demise, and we had to move back to LA, where my girlfriend is from. But to answer your question, it was more the hunger and just if I can make it in the Big Apple, I can make it anywhere.
Indeed. But what about the surfing, man?
Surfing, look, definitely. I had to give it up for a couple of years. I do have salt in my blood, salt water in my blood, I should say. And I'm now in California and loving being able to get up to Malibu or down to El Porto and Manhattan Beach and jumping in the water and getting a few waves and carving my name in a few of those waves out there.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, I'm going to assume, because you said something that I probably threw some of our U.S. listeners for a loop, especially knowing that you're in California. But I know this to be true because I get the privilege of interacting with many people from other countries, and they often tell me, Jay, your real estate is cheap right now. And you said the same thing. You said there was a lower entry point. So for those who are wondering right now, like, what did he say? Lower entry point? Did he really mean that? Can you kind of give us an insight into the Australian perspective, and then understanding the advantage that we actually have right in front of us without even realizing it?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. To back up a little bit, when I was in Australia, I was attending all these events and seminars and seeing these gurus. We got everything in Australia like you do here in the United States. People educating other people on lease options and how to flip a house, and that was what I was absorbing. And I got to the point in Australia, I was still working as a civil engineer, earning some okay money, and I was on the verge of pulling the trigger of doing something in Australia. But the entry point, in a bad neighborhood in Australia, you would still pay upwards of, I don't know, $200,000 of an entry point into an Australian market in a bad house in a somewhat bad neighborhood. Now, you've got to remember, Australia has a population of not even 1/10 of the US. So the population is growing exponentially very quickly. I think there's some statistic out there that it's supposed to double in the next 20 years.
Wow.
And through doubling, the Australian economy the housing market has continued to just, the last 20 years, just like double-digit appreciation. Now, don't ask me why, because I know a lot more about US real estate investing than I do about Australia, but it's got obviously to do with the economy growth and with the spread of how quickly we're growing, and the fact that Australia is, for the most part, is not very inhabitable because our country, the size of our country is the same size as the United States, excluding Alaska in terms of land mass, but we can only really inhabit maybe 15%. 20%, if that. So it's all around the major cities, around the coastline, and that has a knock-on effect. Secondly, is that you don't find cash flow, or not that I had found any cash flow in Australia because the entry point is so high. The rents just don't reflect that you could make, your decent cash flow. So back to your question of, when I moved to the United States, and I was like, wow, I can pick up something for $40,000 and it's going to rent for $1,000 a month or $1,200 a month. It blew my mind, and I was like, I have that.
I can write a check right now. Yeah, this is good.
I have that, or I have 80% of that sitting in my bank account, and so that was really a motivating factor to getting out there and just learning about it. And I was living in New York, so I couldn't buy New York real estate, but I could maybe afford upstate New York, and I started looking around, and all of a sudden I found Syracuse, and we can talk about whether that's a good market or not, but it wasn't the point. The point was that I'd identified a market that I could enter with what I had to work with, and it got me started. Right, it got me on my journey and I not that I've reached any major heights. I'm just saying it's a one step along the way to building long-term wealth.
Indeed. Now let's talk about the journey for a second, because everybody has said journey. I mean, we all start somewhere. What does that look like for you? So I'm assuming this is the first property. It's in Syracuse, and where has it gone since then?
It's been sold. I sold it because
I meant more your journey than just that house, but that's good. That one is done. Now we're on to the next one.
So in terms of, we purchased the first one all cash, moving to the United States, obviously had no credit, zero credit.
Right.
Banks didn't want to lend to me.
Oh, not at all.
So that was an uphill battle. But then you tie that into the fact that I could buy this thing pretty much all cash. So I partnered with another guy who was just like, getting started as well. And we bought this thing together. It was a triplex. And we put some money into it, got it before the appreciation. 6 months later, I pulled some money out of that, bought a second one. And we kept doing that for a period of time until really our money ran out. And now I got to the point where I was like, wow, I have 4 properties-ish, 5 properties, or give or take. I could see the value of duplexes and triplexes and having a little small portfolio, and I was like, wow, this is great, but I have no money. I've no money to do anymore. I was stuck. So a friend of mine, a couple of years back in late 2012, early 2013, or middle of 2013, came down from Canada, and I went out to dinner with him. And I said, mate, look, guess what I'm doing? Like, chuffing away. I've got these properties in upstate New York. Look, I'm killing it. And he said to me, that's great, Reed. Well done. But I just closed on an 80-unit property in Canada, and my mouth just dropped open. I was like, 80 units? You did what? How did you get 80 units? I had studied with this guy back in Australia at university, and he's now closing on an 80-unit property. And anyway, he went on to tell me his story, and and this is where the third penny dropped in my life, was I needed to get to the next level. Like, I was still working full time, investing on the side, making a bit of cash flow, but nothing to be to the point where I'm like, yeah, I can quit my day job. Because the fact is also I have visa issues. To be in this country, I need to have a visa, but we won't get into that.
Right.
But to back to what you're saying, I knew about multifamily, the power of commercial real estate. Well, no, the power of multifamily. I didn't understand the commercial side of it until my friend had really educated me on it, and it just was sort of like that aha moment. It was like, yeah, doing what I'm doing on the duplexes, but timesing it by 60 units was, and the power of the scaling that was just so incredible. But then there was the problem of, well, I can't afford a 60-unit property. How do I afford a 60-unit property? And that's where he was talking about other people's money and syndication and all these words I'd never heard about. And I went and then said, Reed, you got to up your game here. You got to go get yourself a mentor. You got to get yourself educated on how to now take your business, or your investing career to the next level. And that was through starting a personal brand, through websites, through trying to be in front of as many people as I can. You mentioned in the beginning, I've now just recently started a podcast. It's sort of all these different avenues to build credibility. And that's where I'm at today. And, just recently I helped close on a 250-unit deal in Texas. Had no idea that was going to happen last year. It did. I was blown away. But it goes back to making sure that, educating yourself on certain different investing things, different investing vehicles out there in terms of real estate, and then going out and having the mindset to execute that and being surrounded by the credible people, because you can't do it all by yourself.
And the interesting thing that I like about what you just said is you didn't know that was going to happen. However, prior to that happening, the idea of getting 250 units might have been like, yeah, one day, 10 years from now, I'll eventually work up to having 250 units.
Yep.
But yet, suddenly, a new idea comes into your life, a new way of thinking, looking, and perceiving the world, and more importantly, the business that you're doing. Same business. You didn't even change. You just changed some thought processes. And then those thoughts then churned new different actions. And then all of a sudden, you're like, 250 units.
Exactly. And just to clarify to all your listeners out there, I don't personally own 250 units. I was able to pool people's money together and connect the deal with money. And the way I connected the deal with money was because when I first moved to LA, I started this, my online business. I'm still working full time, but I want to really scale my business. I said, I need to start a networking event. And through that networking event that I started, I was able to meet a person who had a really cracking deal in Texas. I was able to connect that deal with my mentor and his bunch of investors, and we were able to get this deal done together. Had no idea it was going to be the size of what it was. We had raised something like, together we raised like $3.5 million or whatever it was. It was like stupidly amount of money, and it was all through, as you're saying, changing your mindset to saying, I can do this, and take action to just doing it, and not necessarily throwing caution to the wind, because it wasn't caution to the wind. It was educating myself on certain topics like large multifamily investing, but understanding that I needed to. No one knew about me. No one knows who Reed Goossens is. A lot of people still don't know who Reed Goossens is, and I needed to get that out there. And the way I got that out there and increase my influence was through a small networking event that is still running today. And we had 30 or 40 investors at the event the other night, which was fantastic. So it's continuing to learn every day. Indeed.
And that's the point. Now, for those of us that are profoundly American-centric, could you tell us what a cracking deal is?
A cracking deal just is my Australian lingo-ness. It means just it's a hot deal. It's a piping hot deal. It's cracking. It's a cracking deal.
I know. I just know somebody somewhere is thinking, what's cracking mean? Jay, they're going to send me an email. Jay, I want a cracking deal. Can you help? Is this deal cracking? I'm like, hold on, guys. He just meant, yeah. I just wanted them to hear you explain it. Otherwise, emails. So,
hot deal.
yeah, totally understood. Now, so now that you've done this, like what's your thing? Like, what's your favorite way to go out there into the real estate space and create value? Okay, so you probably have figured out that creating value is what this whole game is about, and hopefully you are creating value in various different ways. Remember, the ultimate arbiter, the judge, the one who determines whether or not you're creating value is the customer. If you're not receiving money, cash, certificates of appreciation, whatever you want to call them, if you're not getting any, it's simply because you're not creating value. And maybe people don't know that the value you're creating even exists. So, if you want to get some quick lessons on creating value, how to do that, maybe as a real estate investor, pick up a copy of my book. Because you are listening to the podcast, you get a free PDF copy. Just go over to cashflowdiary.com, /free book, or send a text message to 72000. Text the word book, BOOK, to 72000, and I will give you a free electronic copy of the book. And for those of you who like the audio stuff, well, we have a special discounted offer for the audiobook right behind that, if you so choose. Anyway, I know you want to find out, how does the Aussie want to create value? So I'm going to let you get right back to it.
Favorite way in terms of when I identify a property is through forced appreciation. I love, and that's really where it goes back to my mate from Canada who was telling me about the different ways that he's identifying value add properties going in there. And this is just for in layman's terms, say it's a 20-unit property, and it can be, and I was doing it on the smaller stuff. I just didn't realize until he explained it to me in layman's terms. Going in there, understanding that you're looking at an asset, the rents are under market value. You could force that rent by putting in new countertops or spending minimal money, maybe doing some tiling in the bathroom, and then increasing the rent by $50 a month or $100 a month. And doing that over multiple units will force the net operating income. And, for all your listeners out there, if they do or don't know, cap rate theory, cap rate is equal to NOI divided by purchase price. Or value, if you want to replace purchase price with value. You rearrange that formula. I'm a math guy. You increase that NOI, you increase the value of the property. And we could have a whole topic, a podcast, and I'm sure you have covered it quite extensively on how to force appreciation through different, force your income or reduce your operating expenses. So in a nutshell, I love commercial real estate for that reason, because they're valuing the cash flow, not necessarily like in flipping, where they're valuing something that you put into it. So that's what I love.
Well, I also like what you're doing because it's the forced appreciation as opposed to the other types of appreciation, as we all know, because forced is actually something you can do something about. You have a logical reason as to why this is suddenly worth more. It never has made sense to me, Reed. You tell me. Somehow you take the same house, you add shrubbery, and now you add shrubbery, and it's suddenly worth $5,000 more. It's shrubbery, but you take that same shrubbery and put it in a different house, and now that house is only worth $2,000 more. That is too subjective for me, and it drove me nuts.
That's right, and don't get me wrong. I've flipped houses. I've flipped a few houses, but it goes back to, well, what's my time worth? And being in real estate, so being in structural engineering and being in the commercial space, it really goes back to, well, I don't really care as much about the drapery or the type of flooring that I'm putting in to this flip and hoping that someone will pay me more money than what I put into it. And if the market goes south, then I could be up the creek without a paddle. So it was more that, well, I'm spending a ton of time flipping properties, and I did that prior to getting into sort of the larger stuff, and 6-7 months of what it is, but from purchase to finish to completion to running the project management. Why don't just use that 6 or 7 months instead of doing it on one single family property, doing it on 60 units and having cash flow from day one? And that was probably the difference in the value that I saw, and understanding the power of commercial real estate and the valuing that cash flow that the banks love to value, because let's face it, commercial financing is more readily available for commercial real estate than it is for residential. And that's where I saw the power of my time and in terms of leveraging my time and making sure that I'm getting cash flow at the same time, plus forcing the appreciation. So don't get me wrong, you can still make a ton of money in flipping houses. You just horses for courses, and I wanted to be in making sure my time was used correctly.
Absolutely. Now, I happen to know that you also dabble, I'll say, in one of the other types of plays that I like, what I typically call change of use or phased or appreciation, where you actually change the use of a particular type of land, changing it from, whatever it is now to something that it is different. Can you share with us a little bit about what that is so that everyone else can possibly get an idea of like, hey, maybe that's for me. But more importantly, why you find so much value in doing that.
Sure thing. And I think what you're alluding to is re-entitlement.
Right. Yep.
I love re-entitlement. And I have a little bit of an unfair advantage, Jay, that I had been surrounded. This goes back to my engineering days and being surrounded from everywhere in London.
Reed, just so you know, when you told me that you like re-entitlement, I was like, he's got a background or a connection somewhere, because it's usually so complicated for most, I'll say normal folk. But I'm like, we got to talk about it, because if he's got that, other people need to know.
Yes, and that's very, very true, Jay. And to all the listeners out there, I did have a little bit of an unfair advantage, and that was because I happened to be in structural engineering and civil engineering, and that I was part of a team that went and design team that built these large projects, and these large projects were typically pieces of dirt or an existing crappy building, and they've knocked it down and they put something that is worth more there. Now, and at the time, I had no idea what I was doing, for a long period of time. And it wasn't until that penny dropped that I'm like, hang on, this developer's doing something weird here. What's he doing? And I started attending, being part of the design team. I would go to the city, and I've been to the city of New York, and I've been to the city of Philadelphia, and I've been to the city of Los Angeles and Long Beach, back when I was an engineer, and sitting down with Plan Check and saying, oh, these are the structural engineering issues. My drawings are forming part of what's called an overall package that we're presenting to the city, because this particular piece of dirt is zoned. And just for those people out there, zoned means that it's a set of rules and regulations that the city imposes on dirt or land, what you can and can't build. So these developers were going there and saying, hey, I've looked at your rules. I think I can build this. Do you agree? Here's my architecture drawings. Here's my structural engineering drawings. Here's this, blah, blah, blah. And that goes through a process. And that process is called re-entitlement, because you're taking what was currently there, which might be anything from just a bare piece of dirt that you might want to build a single family house on. That could be a re-entitlement play, because you've gone from bare piece of dirt to a single family. Or it could be an existing 10 units, and you want to build, by right, you could build 50 units on it. So you're going to knock it down and build 50 units. That process takes a period of time, and that re-entitlement process typically, I'm not going to quote anything, it may be 12 months, but that goes from, developers understand that they can identify a piece of land or a lot and take it to its maximum and best use. And doing that means that you got to go to the city and say to the city, I've looked at your regulations and your rules. Here's what I'm proposing. Do you agree with what I'm doing? And, it'll take a back and forth, and you'll say, oh, we need to change a bit of the style of the building or whatever it might be, or we need to have some low-income housing in here, or it could be a slew of things. But that process is then so valuable, because once it's permitted, once they say, we agree, we got to a point, we've got to an agreement, that piece of land is now worth not infinitely more, but a lot more money, because it's valuable now, and you've gone through the process. And so then there's a second phase of that. You could literally, and I've seen it happen, and I saw it happen in New York in my engineering office that I was working for in there. We would design something. It would come through the door, it'd be, 20-story building. And it will come through the door. We'll design it, structural engineer, blah, blah, blah. We'll go get it permitted. Okay, great. 2 months later, it comes back through our door. And they're like, well, actually, we just want to change a few structural things. We want to put a few balconies here and, whatever. And it's under a different developer's name. And I didn't realize it at the time, but the original developer had actually sold that permitted set of drawings and land to another developer who's now taking that on, but just wants to slightly change, a few things, which required a structural engineer to look at it again. So it was sort of like, I was like, why aren't people doing more of this? And now identifying that and seeing those types of biggest and best use. So you might drive past a 10-unit property, but it might be able to build 50 units if you know what you're doing in terms of the rules and regulations. So I hope that answers a little bit of your question.
Well, yeah, it also illustrates the complexity and also answers the question as to why aren't more people doing it? Because it's all of what you just said. That is a very unique perspective first and skill set to be able to go, hey, this 10-unit building should actually be a car wash. Not,
right.
That's a unique gift in and of itself. Then you add to that being able to talk to the right individuals in the right way to get them to go, yes, we agree with you, in and of itself is a completely different obstacle in and of itself. So when you pull all that together, the path of least resistance, you know what, this 10-unit building, I think I'll keep it as a 10-unit building because that's the obvious play. But as you have alluded to, taking that extra step, gaining those extra skills, it is very, very lucrative. It's why I love change of use plays, is because you could, in fact, it gives you an unfair advantage because in that particular example, you could probably pay more than what someone else would pay for that very same building because your end game is going to create so much value.
Exactly. And don't get me wrong, Jay, all of this information is readily available to the public. A zoning, what a piece of lot is zoned by, you can go on any website, any government county website and look it up. It just takes the time and effort. And so it's just understanding the sort of players you need to have involved. And I'll go through the team members. You'll need an architect. That's for one. You're definitely going to need an architect. You're going to need a what's called an expediter. They're people or a land use person who understands the different zoning requirements and what you can be tricky with in terms of, well, if I provide out of 20 units, if I provide 6 units that are low to middle income housing, or I can actually then go and get a density bump, which means I could build 25 units because I've people want low cost housing here in LA, so cities and government officials look kindly on that sort of stuff, and understanding what you can and can't build is really, really important. You're obviously going to need a structural engineer, and you're going to need maybe a civil engineer to just look at some values. But if you understand that these are just you talk about flipping houses, think of an architect, a fee to pay an architect, and a fee to pay a structural engineer, and a fee to pay whatever you need on your team. Think of it as like, oh, I need to do tiling in the bathroom. I need to do fix the roof. I need to change, concrete the front driveway of a single family fix and flip property. It's the same thing. It's just a different line item, and applying and just understanding those line items to get to your bottom dollar, and then understanding what you could build beyond that, if that makes sense. So hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, but absolutely. In fact, I don't think everyone just realized that you just gave them I'm going to say a potential 7-figure business, but if they were listening in between the lines, it's like he just told you, here's how you could go make a whole bunch of money and create a lot of value. In the meantime, if you were listening, now somebody's going to be like, oh man, I got to rewind, but that's okay. Now, typically when it comes to these reentitlement issues or projects, if you will, what is typically the architect, expediter, structural, and civil engineer going to run someone?
It will depend on the project. Typically when I was working in, and this is loose figures, please don't quote any of this on what. Sure. But if it's a commercial building, like if you're only building 6 units and it was a single family house, that's reentitlement. You might have a simple reentitlement might be that you have a large lot and you have a house that is movable, and you shift that house to the front of the lot and you split it, and you just create 2 different houses. That's reentitlement. On the level that I'm doing it, or attempting to do it here in California, is more like 20, 30, 40, 50 new units. And, an architect can run at, $100,000, $150,000, but that's the entire process. But that's just, again, a line item, and being comfortable with those figures is just part and parcel of, when someone first looked at flipping a house, I don't want to pay 10 grand to do the roof. It's like, well, that's just what it costs, and you get used to that. Oh, it's 10 grand here in LA or whatever it might be. It might be 6 grand in the Midwest, and you just get used to those figures. So, roughly around $150,000 for an architect. Then you're going to have a structural engineer, and then you're going to have a civil engineer, and you probably a reentitlement project on say 50 units. If we'll probably run you in the order of $300,000 to $400,000. Now, remember, part of what I bring to the table in terms of my skill set being an unfair advantage, and we can talk about that, is that sometimes I'm now talking with architects who will defer that payment to once you've got it approved. You might have to give them a bit of money up front, And once you've got it approved and reentitled and an increased value, then you could go and sell it to another developer, and they will get their money on the back end. And I've talked with a few architects who are readily available in LA to do that sort of stuff. So if you are interested, I can definitely connect people with the right types of people. So,
well, I'm sure you're going to get a few emails, but one of the things that I was just thinking about that you had mentioned earlier is the subject of negotiations. People fail to realize how much value there is in that, but somebody, one of you, I'm talking to you, we're listening right now, and when he said the architect was 100, you were all with us. Then he said the architect was $100,000, and you was like, oh man, you just exited the conversation, stage left. Hopefully you are still listening, because later you heard him come up with a way to negotiate. Yes, that $100,000 is still quote unquote owed and due. It's very well earned, but it's when it needed to be paid that got changed that probably opened this door right back up for you. Hopefully you were listening and you now understand why negotiations becomes one of the most important skills in this particular business as a whole. So when it comes to these types of projects, some would say that California is by far the most challenging state, probably next to New York, to do this in. Mm-hmm. Would you agree?
I would agree.
Yeah. Okay. I'm like, dude, try to make it easier. Go somewhere else and do it.
I've reentitled, I guess you could say reentitled. I've done a few fix and flips in Philadelphia, which required me to go to the city in Philly. I added like 2 stories to an existing building. That still required going to the city and understanding, okay, hey city, it's zoned to do this. Do you agree? Blah, blah, blah. The steps we just went through. That took 4 to 8 weeks. It was pretty quick. That's in Philadelphia. In New York and LA, it can take longer. It also goes down to the size of the project. So please don't, hopefully listeners aren't getting lost in that $100,000. That was for a 50-unit deal. You can, as I said, you can still re-entitle land by just splitting the block if it's large enough and putting another house on it or something of that nature on a smaller scale. And I'm at 10. There's a lot of steps before you get to 10, and a lot of way of creating some great value. So please don't get lost in that. It's just, as I said, the biggest takeaway point is that it's a line item. And being understanding that line item is just getting comfortable with it. So.
Indeed. Well, the other thing that I wanted to bring up was exactly what you just said. This is not something you're going to do in a weekend. So don't go in with that expectation. That doesn't mean it's not valuable. Clearly it is. It's just not something you're going to do in a weekend. That's really what I was going after. So with all of these things being done, what's like new? What's new on the horizon for you, sir?
New on the horizon is the podcast, very much so. I'm part of a group, or want to be part of a group called Key Persons of Influence, which talk just about being Googleable, and then it goes back to being working on the business, not in the business, and it goes back to funny enough, when you're raising capital, it's nearly a marketing ploy up until a point, because you need to be in front of people. As you're saying, I need to go to networking events. I need to develop. You yourself, Jay, develop a whole bunch of online content. I'm looking to develop that in the future. So with the podcast and maybe a book. I don't know. It's a small basic book on my journey here in the United States, or learning what an LLC is, because that's the point of what my podcast is trying to introduce people to US investing in real estate, and that the entry points are a little bit easier here than in other countries. But where do people start? Well, they need to start somewhere, and there's a bit of misinformation out there. So hopefully that was my podcast. The point of my podcast was to provide that information. If I can turn it into a book or some online videos, and great. And that's just going to help me with my underlying business, RSM Property Group. So, yeah.
Indeed. And speaking of which, I'm sure that many listening to you thus far have learned that, well, he knows stuff. And I want to know stuff like him. So how can they track you down and find out more stuff?
Sure thing. The easiest way to reach me is at my email is Reed, that's REED, at rsnpropertygroup.com. That's R for Roger, S for Sam, N for Nancy, all one word, or you can go to my podcast, which is Investing in the US. The subline is An Aussie's Guide to US Real Estate. If you search that on iTunes, I'm sure it will pop up and you'll see my ugly mug and listen to that. And yeah, I'm always interested in talking with people who want to get started. And I just love talking real estate. So that's where you can reach me.
Indeed, indeed. So final question here. Let's pretend for a second that there's someone listening who is considering putting on their superhero outfit for the first time. They want to become that entrepreneur, real estate entrepreneur. They think, ooh, maybe I can do this. Maybe you got them excited with the whole entitlement thing. And and they're like, wow, this would be awesome if I could change and impact the world. However, they still have that voice in the back of their head. And I know, Reed, you know that voice. Mm-hmm. You've done battle with that voice time and time again. So what would you say to that person who is yet to move forward, but is still grappling and wrestling daily with that voice in the back of their head?
I would say to that person who's listening to this show is you need the desire, you want the desire to change. If you don't have that desire to change and be willing enough to take the action steps to do that, then you need to be. And what does that mean? That means surrounding yourself with like-minded individuals, going to networking events, listening to podcasts, reading books. Once you get to a point where you're comfortable, then you can start taking action. And it's, goes back to increasing your financial IQ or just educating yourself on how you can create whatever it might be, whether it be an entrepreneur or whether it be long-term wealth or whatever that might be, and understanding your why factor and really acting on that. And that's probably my biggest. I would say, if you, and this is going to be an action step for everyone. I challenge everyone out there. If you're thinking about it, you're just starting to listen to Jay's podcast, go to 5 networking events related to real estate in your local area. And if you haven't found someone that you can find value out of, if you haven't learned anything, then don't go, but I highly doubt that you won't learn something from those events. So get out there and get amongst it.
Excellent. Great advice. Love the action orientation of everything. Thank you, sir, for taking the time to invest your knowledge here with us at the Cashflow Diary.
Thanks a lot, Jay. Much appreciated.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you know what time it is. It's time for you to move at the speed of instruction. What does that mean? Well, it probably means you need to fire off an email, especially if you want more information about that whole entitlement thing, because I'm sure that intrigued you. But here's the point. Get started. It doesn't matter where you are. What matters is what you have is probably your unique advantage. You just heard from Reed, who found his unique advantage in many different ways, and most importantly has taken action on it. And because he has taken action, he is now seeing results. That therefore means it's time for you to do the same. It's been fun talking to you today. I look forward to talking to you soon. Until next time.